Howdy, friends. Welcome to the Shotcast. We're going to be talking about Colossians chapter 4.
Yeah, right off the bat, we have in verse 1 a call for masters to be just and fair to your slaves. Whenever we read that word slaves in the Bible, it often gets a cringing reaction from us because we are so an anti-slavery culture, obviously. And now, even though the Bible is mentioning slavery, that doesn't mean that God is saying like, okay, yeah, you should own slaves. But it is important for us to recognize the culture that we're talking about right now. So within the culture of Jewish society, there were a lot of differences about slavery back then. First of all, if you were a slave, you were under the protection of that household. So you were guaranteed food, you were guaranteed living. It was actually in protection, like literal physical protection from anyone who would maybe try and attack you. So it was actually a very good situation for some people. It was better than being poor and begging on the streets. And so some people would actually sell themselves into slavery in Jewish culture. Now, we are talking about a letter that's written to a non-Jewish culture. This is a Gentile culture, but it's still the same type of, this is a Christian community. So you're bringing that same Jewish belief system, that Jewish moral system into this Gentile community. So their version of slavery would be similar to, or what they're talking about here, that's kind of being almost okayed in a way, would be similar to that of the Jewish one. It would not be our version of that, because I do believe that Paul and other church leaders would condemn what we think of as slavery today. But anyways, to move on from that, what this is talking to is reminding slave owners or masters that in the Christian culture, God calls us to be fair, to be just, to not lord over anyone who might be considered our subordinate. So in Matthew 25, 20, something like that, Jesus is talking to the disciples and he's saying, with you guys, it's going to be different than it is with the world. The rulers of this world, the masters, the authorities, they lord their power over people and they wield it as a weapon. But among you guys, it's not going to be like that. If you want to be great, you actually have to become the servant. And that's when Jesus goes on to teach about servitude. And so that's what this is saying. It's a call for masters to, instead of wielding a sword and being powerful, to actually become the servant, even though by the world standards, they could claim the title of master and could claim authority.
That's so good. It's really saying don't lose sight of the fact. It says, remember that you also have a master in heaven. So while you can be distracted by all these things and you might want to get angry with the people that are your slaves, to be just and to be fair and to not forget at all that this is not where it ends. And so we move on to an encouragement for prayer. This is verse 2. It says, devote yourselves to prayer with an alert mind and a thankful heart. So this comes out of the NLT. I know it's different in different versions, but devote yourselves in prayer with an alert mind. Oftentimes, I think about the times where the disciples fell asleep on the boat and Jesus is like, what are you doing? Because they were just not alert, in the same way that we're praying in different times of the day, whether that's the morning or night or all throughout our day, and we're not with this alert mind. It could be meaning something like that. It could be meaning the intentionality behind your heart and behind the prayer. You're talking to God who considers us a friend. We're not talking to this imaginary friend. This is someone we're actually talking to and we're conversating with. And it's just so intentional and deep and special. And so don't be talking to God like he's just some magical thing. God is your father. He's your friend. And just being intentional with that conversation, not to go on and babble and to be saying what sounds good. Oftentimes we'll hear throughout the Bible, don't be hypocrites, those praying on the streets, that's the only glory they'll ever receive is them praying on the streets. And so to be super intentional with our prayers, be alert and be thinking about all the things that you could be praying about for other people, not just yourself. Yeah. Having a thankful heart, coming from a place of gratitude. If that's all you get down in your prayer, I would consider that a success until you move on to something deeper. If you're just starting with thanks and that's where you're at right now, that's where you're at until it progresses into, now I want to pray for Aspen and now I want to pray for my family and things like that. Just coming with a thankful heart is super important in this situation, in this verse.
Yeah, and gratitude snowballs. You start with one thing, and then there's going to be a bunch of other things that bubble up inside of you of like, oh, and that, and I'm thankful for that too. And gratitude cannot simultaneously be with anxiety. It can't. It cannot be together. And so if you are grateful, your joy is going to increase, your peace is going to increase, all of that. Because how can you be anxious? How can you be worried whenever you're thankful for so much?
Yeah.
And so moving right along to that next kind of section of verses, we have in verse 5 and 6, live wisely among those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone. And that attractive has a little star by it for me. And it's a footnote that says, or seasoned with salt, or and seasoned with salt. And that I loved because it reminded me of Jesus' teaching about salt and light, how he talks about that we are the salt of the earth, and what good is salt if it loses its saltiness? Right. What he's saying there is, if you're going to be a Christian, what good are you if you blend in with the rest of the world? What good are you if you don't stand out? You have to stand out if you're a Christian, because that's how you represent God, is that in conversation, what are the things that set you apart? The world's conversation looks a lot like gossip. The world's conversation looks a lot like complaining. And so as Christians, we have to be the opposite of that. And that's what people recognize as, this isn't normal. This isn't a normal friendship. This isn't a normal coworker. And so they start to think, what's different about them? And that question, that thought process leads them to be attracted to Jesus. And that's our goal here, is as Christians, we want to be pulling people in to follow Jesus too.
That's so good. That's the whole reason I became a Christian, because there was a Christian at my school that, like verse 5, was living wisely amongst the non-believers. Wow. She was living wisely amongst me, somebody that was not a believer. And I saw the joy and I saw the patience and the gentleness that came from someone like that. And I wanted to know more. So Aspen, that is such a good point. And just making the most out of every single opportunity. Yeah. Oftentimes in the mundane parts of our days, in the grocery store and at the doctor's office, we think that those aren't opportunities. And man, how awkward would it be if I talk to God about talk to God with my person that's doing my nails, because now I have to sit here for another hour. And these are the things where it's like, no, this is an opportunity. Can you see it? Do you have the eyes to see that this is a great opportunity to go ahead and spread the gospel? Let your conversation be gracious. Let your conversation be gracious. That is something that oftentimes we can struggle with the passion in our heart for Jesus, because we get angry about the fact that he's misunderstood because we know him. And how would you feel if Aspen's one of my best friends. If someone was defaming Aspen's name, I would be angry because I know Aspen and I love her, and it would make me upset. And so oftentimes to be gracious, it's really hard when someone's not respecting God. And so not to say that you can't feel that passion, but to come across with grace, to have conversations that are attractive. And that's not watering down the gospel to make it more attractive to their lifestyle. It's not that kind of attractive. It's like, hey, this is the kind of attractiveness that you would see it and you would want to take part in it. Yeah. You're like, wow, maybe I don't really understand. It even talks about the mysterious plan of Christ. Like you might not know the mysterious plan. You might not know what's going on in that conversation, but with the grace and the honesty and the truth of that conversation, the gentleness, you will be attracted to that conversation to know more. And so I love that it even goes on to say that you'll have the right response. And this isn't to pressure you to say the exact thing. That's not exactly the right response. Sometimes the right response is a reaction. Your response is the way you're carrying yourself. And that can be the right response in itself. Not that you're going to have this perfect conveyed, written out response. You don't get to have that kind of pressure because God is working through you. And so that's not exactly for you to bear and take on, to have this perfect response, but to have the right response, to be gentle and to be gracious. Yeah, that's really good. Right off of what you said, Alexa, about making the most of every opportunity, there's a scripture in 2 Timothy 4 where Paul is encouraging Timothy, and he says, fully carry out the ministry God has given you.
And I love that encouragement because we have all been given a ministry by God. And that says a few things. First of all, that God trusts us. God entrusts us with a ministry. The second thing is, he's not talking about me carrying out your ministry. I'm not supposed to carry out your ministry. Right. I'm supposed to carry out my ministry, the ministry that God has given me. Yeah. And so why do we as Christians look around and we say, oh, but I wish that I could have that ministry? Right. No, God didn't call you to carry out Alexa's ministry. God called you to carry out the ministry that he has given you. Yeah. And so fully carry out the ministry that he has given you. And that's the same with every opportunity. We all have circles. Whether it's the second that you're in the grocery store, that's the ministry for that moment, or whether it's on the baseball field because that's the sport that your whole family plays, whether it's at your church, your local church, that ministry, like we all have multiple ministries. And so what ministry did God put you in? Fully carry it out. Make the most of every single opportunity.
That was so good. I love that. Carrying out the ministry set before you. That is just so different than maybe somebody else's. That was so good, Aspen. Love it. So moving on, we have verse 12. And it says, he always prays earnestly for you, asking God to make you strong and perfect, fully confident that you are following the whole will of God. And if that could just be our prayer for our friends, I love that we don't have to question what we should be praying for oftentimes. And really every time that I personally can think of, it is laid out here before us, all the ways, all the models of prayer from Matthew to even just the things we can be praying for in Philippians. And now even here that you're praying for God to make you strong and perfect. And we know that we could never be perfect. Yeah. But that doesn't mean we're not looking to the perfect God and trying to be that reflection of Jesus. And so don't get trapped in that word and don't let it overwhelm you. That's still the goal. Even though you might not reach everything perfectly to its full complexity, you still have these goals that you're trying to carry out. And so I love how it says that. Yeah. And also just praying that they're fully confident. Man, how many times have people not carried out what they were supposed to do because they weren't fully confident about it? There's so many situations in my life where I didn't have the confidence to carry out the calling that God was calling me to until I had someone praying on my behalf, or I had someone say, no, you can do that, and instilling this confidence in me. And no matter how many times you tell somebody, oh, be confident, you're great at this, you're good at that, there's nothing like the power of prayer. There's nothing like praying for them to have that revelation, because it's one thing to hear it from you, but it's another thing to hear it from their Heavenly Father through prayer or through meditation. Like, these are all the things we can be praying for. Praying that you are following the whole will of God, that God is not just saying to do one thing, that there's actually so many things that are in God's will that we can be carrying out. And so understanding what God's will is for your life. And that's why it's so important that we're intentional with our prayer life and that we have our own deep, intimate relationship with God, because your will looks different, or God's will for you looks different than somebody else's. And so having that discernment, you cannot just read or hear from others and know the will that God has for you. That requires a very deep relationship with him that he'll reveal to you little bits at a time, or maybe all at once. I don't know. But oftentimes it looks like, hey, let me just call you here. Let me just call you here. And you just being obedient to the little things. And that really does paint the picture of God's whole will for you.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too that people get tripped up because they think that they can't mess up God's will for them. And to that, I would say yes and no, because God is absolutely sovereign. And so we can't mess up his overarching will for humanity. But you can mess up. Is it God's will that you sin today? No. So you absolutely can mess up his will. And so that's why we constantly have to be seeking. And I don't say that as something to be that's like this instilling fear inside of you. That's not what it is. But it is a precaution of being like, hey, I want you to know so that you fully are aware and you are cautious as you're walking out your life. You can marry the wrong person. You can absolutely mess up. And that's just the reality. And so, like you said, that you are striving for this perfection, and that perfection is Christ, is that we're never going to be able to be Christ. We will never measure up, but we're striving to look like him every single day, and that's the goal of our life.
Thank you guys so much for checking us out. We go live Mezzanine 7:30 every Monday night, so don't forget to look at that.
Make sure you like and subscribe and tune in next week for this episode of the Shotcast. We'll see you later.
Bye.